Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Basavanna, or Bashava. Basavanna was a 12th century Indian poet, religious reformer, politician. He had begun life as part of the Brahmin caste, which is the highest caste in Hinduism. He was born into an Orthodox Hindu family, but as a young man, he broke with Orthodox Hinduism. He gave up his Brahmin status, and he sort of founded / joined a group that were known as the Virashaivas. I may be pronouncing that wrong. I apologize if I am. But the Virashaivas were a Bakhti sect. And Bakhti was a movement starting really around the 11th, 12th century, somewhere in there, that it was sort of like the Protestant Reformation, except it never toppled Orthodox Hinduism. Not that Catholicism was toppled, but Catholicism was substantially weakened in Europe. The Bakhti sect were reformers, and they were, to a certain extent at least, inspired by the coming of Islam to India, because Bakhti took the monotheistic impulse of Islam and tried to apply it to Hinduism. So Hinduism is, as most people will probably know, is a polytheistic religion. They have a lot of deities. That's a slightly complex statement because there's a notion that there's a lot of deities, and yet at the same time, all of the deities are, and all existence is sort of one unified being. Anyway, not crucial for the point I'm making. So what the Bakhti tended to do was to identify one god from the Hindu pantheon and either say this is the only god that matters, or this is either this is the only god or this is the only god that's really important. In a way, it's a bit like Akhenaten in ancient Egypt, right? Akhenaten says the Aten is the only god that actually exists. The Bakhti say we've picked a particular Hindu god, that is the god. For Basavanna, this was Shiva, Lord Shiva, who's one of the big three in Hinduism, along with Brahma and Vishnu. So Basavanna was a religious radical. His sect, the Virashaivas, definitely challenged the Orthodox Hindu approach, the polytheism of Orthodox Hinduism, and they challenged some of the other tenets of Hinduism as well, particularly things like the caste system. So the caste system is very, very important in Hinduism. It deals with this question, it deals with issues of rebirth, reincarnation, and hopefully, moving up the sort of chain of existence towards for some reason the Hindu term is gone out of my head. In Buddhism, it's nirvana, but I don't think Hindus use the term nirvana. I may be wrong about that. Anyway, doesn't matter. So the idea of like being reborn into a higher station in the sort of great chain of existence, etc., etc. The Virashaivas were not fans of the caste system. They were a very egalitarian group, and that did bring them into conflict with Orthodox Hindus periodically. But we see that disdain for Hindu polytheism, as well as for the mechanics of the caste system in Basavanna's poetry. So I'm going to take you through some of those. By the way, these are the poems I'm reading are out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. This is a very small selection of Basavanna's total poetic output. Also, they don't have The poems don't have titles. They do have numbers. I don't know where these numbers come from. And I assume the numbers aren't going to be meaningful, so I'm going to use the convention of referring to these poems by their first line. So one poem that is very much a sort of satire critique of orthodox polytheistic Hinduism is "The pot is a god, the winnowing." So that poem goes like this. The pot is a god, the winnowing fan is a god, the stone in the street is a god, the comb is a god, the bowstring is also a god, the bushel is a god, and the spouted cup is a god. Gods, gods, there are so many, there's no place left for a foot. There is only one God, he is our Lord of the meeting rivers. So the first stanza of this list of things that are identified as gods, this is a sort of direct satire of polytheism, right? Because in polytheism, at least in many polytheistic systems, there's a wide range of gods, some of whom have a very, very narrow focus. They're in charge of a very, very small thing. Some of whom are big gods who do big things, some of whom are little gods who do little things. So the idea that a pot, a winnowing fan, a stone, a comb, etc., can all be gods is not necessarily outside the basic logic of polytheism. And what Basavanna says about this, or what the poet persona says about this, more accurately, is gods, gods, there are so many, there's no place left for a foot. And the foot, of course, the foot in in traditional Indian cosmology is, I think, regarded as a relatively low part of the body, right? I think in Hindu scriptures, I forget which deity it is, but there is a deity who is sort of cut up, and the different portions of his body become the sort of foundations of the different castes. The head becomes the Brahmins, those who work with their mind and do religious work, etc., etc. But the feet become the workers, untouchables, people like this. The lowest of the low in terms of the caste system. And so there's very much this sort of denigration of feet. And Basavanna asserts the value of the foot, the value of the low, in contrast to this plurality of gods. So it's very much a critique of Orthodox Hinduism. We've also got poems that challenge the caste system, that sort of overtly undermine this. Like this one, "Look here, dear fellow." And this is a sort of indirect attack on the caste system. It's more directly an attack on gender roles, but gender roles and divisions are run on a similar logic to the caste system, right? The idea in Hinduism that everyone is born into a particular station in life, and what you have to do is not necessarily try and change your worldly place within this life, but you have to accumulate karma to be born into a better dharma in a future life, a better station in life. So this idea of sort of disrupting that idea, disrupting that notion of stability, we see that in this poem, "Look here, dear fellow." "Look here, dear fellow, I wear these men's clothes only for you. Sometimes I am man, sometimes I am woman. O Lord of the meeting rivers, I'll make wars for you, but I'll be your devotee's bride." So again, this breaking down of divisions, the breaking down of a clear distinction between male and female identities, but also roles within society. The idea that those could be blended within one person really undermines the idea of social distinction. And then we've also got poems that sort of challenge traditional approaches to Hindu worship. Poems like "The Rich" or "I Don't Know Anything Like Time Beats and Meter," both of which sort of undermine these very ritualized tradition and externally structured approaches to worship, right? So the rich, this is a critique of the importance of temples as opposed to individual faith, individual devotion in a deity. So the rich will make temples for Shiva. What shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, the body the shrine, the head a cupola of gold. Listen, O Lord of the meeting rivers, things standing shall fall, but the moving shall ever stay. So this idea of you build pillars, you build temples, you build shrines, you build these grand structures, and that's how you show your devotion to the gods. But the body, the being, the individual themselves can be that temple in Basavanna's poetry here. This idea of individual worship, individual devotion and expressions of devotion as more valuable, more valid than the temples built by the wealthy. That, and if we take a look back at this last stanza, listen, O Lord of the meeting rivers, things standing shall fall, but the moving shall ever shall stay. This idea that, like, we think of a temple as permanent, right? Reasonably permanent, at least, whereas the individual is temporary. But the devotion of the individual in this poem is more permanent than the limited worldly external thing represented by the temple, by the shrine, whatever it is. So we've got that critique of traditional Hindu methods of worship. We've also got this critique in I Don't Know Anything Like Time Beats and Meter, which advocates, again, a sort of spontaneous individual expression of devotion as opposed to highly regularized liturgy, right? These sort of pre-written, pre-scripted ceremonies. So this poem goes, I don't know anything like time beats and meter, nor the arithmetic of strings and drums. I don't know the count of iamb and dactyl. My lord of the meeting rivers, as nothing will hurt you, I'll sing as I love. And that idea, that's actually quite a beautiful last line. I'll sing as I love. Really, really, really spectacular line. But this idea that my worship will be spontaneous and truthful because it is not rooted in this is the way in which you must worship kind of thing. Yeah. So Basavanna is really interested in these ideas. And he is also, so one of the other components of Basavanna's poetry, one of the other big components is worldly suffering. And this kind of gets, I don't know that this is a Buddhist influence necessarily, but it's kind of in the same vein as Buddhism, right? Because the first noble truth of the Buddha is that existence is suffering, right? Basavanna seems very interested in this idea that being in the world, having dharma, that is a place within the scheme of the universe, a specific place that you occupy because of your karmic level, whatever it is, that is an inherently unjust system, that it imposes suffering on people unnecessarily, and that it's basically bad. It's something that should be rejected, whether or not that idea as such sort of makes sense in the context of Orthodox Hindu theology. But again, in the context of Basavanna's Bakhti heterodoxy, it may make more sense. So we see that, for instance, this idea of the suffering of existence in a poem like Father, in my ignorance you brought me, which goes like this. Father, in my ignorance you brought me through mother's wombs, through unlikely worlds. Was it wrong just to be born, O Lord? Have mercy on me for being born once before. I give you my word, Lord of the meeting rivers, never to be born again. And so again, this idea of sort of resistance to Hindu theology and the idea of reincarnation, that you are born over and over and over again as you accumulate good or bad karma, and that determines your station in your next birth. The poet persona here seems to say, I'm going to step out of that system that encodes suffering, really. So again, Basavanna, a very, very interesting poet, part of this movement that challenged Hindu thought. A very interesting, very good writer.